Bien, bonjour.
Well, welcome to all of you. Apparently, there was some confusion last Thursday for some listeners as regards where the lectures and the seminar will be held. Let me point out once again that as of this year, the lectures and seminar will now be held at two different locations. The normal lectures on Thursday mornings at 11 a.m. will still be held here at Marcelin Berthelot in this amphitheater. Whereas since this year, the seminar on Thursday afternoon will now be held at Cardinal Lemoine, meaning at 52 Rue du Cardinal Lemoine. It's not hard to find. It's just beside the fire brigade. And this is where we find the Orientalist libraries of the Collège de France. And as a matter of fact, this is why we thought it was more logical to organize the seminars at that location, because this is where most researchers are concentrated around libraries. Let me also point out that the seminar will be held every 2 weeks this year, but for 3 hours each time instead of an hour and a half. So from 3 to 6 p.m. Since the seminar started last Thursday, there will be no seminar this afternoon. Last Thursday, we resumed our studies for this year at the Collège de France, and I pointed out that this was a sort of miracle for me to have been able to be here, given the state of extreme weakness in which my husband is currently in, vanquished by a long and painful battle against cancer. Once again today I stand before you, even though the situation has worsened even further. My husband is now in palliative care, and I believe that you can guess what that may mean. But I must point out that I spoke to him yesterday about the lessons, the lectures I will continue to give at the Collège de France, and that in his moments of consciousness, he understood and approved the fact that I was here with you this morning instead of being by his side. So at our last lecture, I spoke about a sort of obstination, doggedness, that's not even therapeutic. But I believe that it helps both of us in holding out. And it's what the British would call a sort of doggedness. Like being obstinate like a dog. I'm continuing as much as I can at all costs and against all odds. Obviously, I must repeat once again that there is increasing uncertainty with every day, and I can only urge you once again to stay tuned on the website of the Collège de France, even just before coming to the lectures, to be sure that the lectures will be held or not. Last week, we resumed our study in search of this famous Confucius, and so ill-known at the same time paradoxically, In other words, especially today, a lot of talk about him in the media, and yet it's so difficult to seize, to capture. We retrace the path followed over the past 4 years, working back in time, starting with the contemporary situation, with the phenomenon we are currently observing in mainland China, primarily with the return of Confucius, including the two key milestones of what I call the Confucius globalization. The first being European in the 17th and 18th century, and the second, globalization, being American after the Second World War. So we started with this contemporary situation with the return of Confucius, and we, at the end of our lectures last year, we arrived at the return to Confucius. The return to Confucius, which we focused on last year to close our cycle on Confucius Revisited. This Confucius comeback is just as modern and contemporary as the return of Confucius, except that the return of Confucius relates to mainland China primarily, where he has truly become a societal phenomenon, whereas the return to Confucius is something noted at planetary level. Europe, the Americas, China, including all of Eastern Asia, Australia, and so on. So the return to Confucius is indeed a global phenomenon, but that primarily relates to academia and sinologists in particular. So we can speak of a sort of sinological international movement with this return to Confucius. In that sense, we can speak about the third globalization of Confucius. Since we're talking about critical members of academia, normally as a member of academia, you must always seek a critical distance. This return to Confucius is not at all fundamentalist, quite the opposite. I would say it's rather a deconstructionist trend that tends to push deconstruction all the way so as to dismantle the very foundations of what we believed for centuries to be the foundation beyond approach of the sacred figure of Confucius and his teachings. For centuries it was thought that it was laid down in the Liu primarily, the work that is referred to in English as the Analects of Confucius. I believe it is now useful for us to once again look at how this deconstruction endeavor was launched, so to speak. First and foremost, we must recall, and here I'm recalling you the main highlights, sort of a summary of what was said last year, so that we can see on what basis we can speak this year about a sort of figure of Confucius resurrected. You certainly recall, those of you who were curious enough to take a look at this text, the Lu Yu, as transmitted to us, is a work that is not very big. It is divided, according to tradition, into what we call pian here. That's the word you can see at the top left of the screen. So the current edition is presented in 20 pian. This term is usually translated in English as a book or chapter. Now you must note, I don't know if you can really see at the top of the character, the radical for bamboo. And that reminds us that the text, like most texts in ancient China, was usually written on strips of bamboo with one column of characters per strip, so written vertically. And these strips were then bounded together using little cords. Here you can see the cords at two levels, dividing the height of the strips into 3/3 that are relatively equal in size. So these bounded strips, here you find the manuscript unrolled, so it will be transported rolled, a bit like Venetian blinds. Now the 20 pian that we find in the current edition of the Lu Yu are subdivided approximately into 600 cheng, which is translated, according to tradition, as a section. So, according to Western sinological tradition, in general, the pians or chapters are numbered with Roman letters, and sections are numbered with Arabic numerals. As you may see, these sections in general are quite brief, one or a few sentences at the most. Very few are those that are significantly longer than that, and many of them are introduced with this well-known canonical formula, Su Yu, meaning the master says. But we pointed out again last week that since there is no specifier in Chinese, especially in ancient Chinese, it could also mean a master, or if some masters say. Only some sections are introduced more explicitly with the formula Gong Zi Yue, meaning Master Kong, specifying therefore his last name. And there are also occasionally formulas such as Zheng Ni Yue, Zheng Ni being a more personal name for the master. This introductive formula, which then opens up to a message that is supposed to be a direct message, meaning the very words, ipsissima verba, words said directly by the master, as if you were there in a way. led us to believe that we are dealing with a collection of conversations that the Master may have had with his disciples or his contemporaries. What's quite striking for contemporary readers, as we are, is that we get the feeling that when you move from one section to another linearly, most of the time you have the feeling that there's no order at all, no logic, no common thread. And this impression of a random series is reinforced by the conventional choice made by publishers of this text to entitle each pian or chapter in a way using the first two words of the chapter in question. And this is how here you have the title, so to speak, of chapter 1, Shua. These are two words which don't really mean much put together. It just means study and. So here is not a title that claims to mean something. We also recalled last year that the first information that we have on the Luyu is not in the text itself, which does not contain any preface, introduction, or postface. As a matter of fact, nothing that looks like a meta text. Now, this information on the text was given through sources dating back to the Han period. In other words, they were not before the 2nd century BC or even after that period, meaning that all the information that we have on this text is clearly after Confucius's lifetime. Here are the dates, traditionally 551 to 479 BC. Let me remind you that the first time we heard about the title of the Analects. Oh, I'm just showing you here in passing a picture that people like to portray of Confucius in China today. Confucius as Superman. So the first information on the very title of the work, we find this information in chapter 30 of the Han Shu, meaning the history of the Han, the Western Han Dynasty. A dynasty split into two, one before or Western and one afterwards or Eastern. Let us say between the Western Han Dynasty occupying the 2 first centuries BC and the posterior Eastern Han Dynasty during the first 2 centuries of the Christian era. So this chapter 30 of the history of the Western Han is a bibliographical chapter called the Treaty on Arts and Letters. And the story of the Western Hans was largely compiled by a historian called Pang Ko, whom you can see here. And he lived between 32 and 92, in the first century, therefore, of the Christian era. This is quite logical, because historians of the dynasties wrote the history of the previous dynasties. So you'd have an historian who lived in the reign of the Eastern Han Dynasty and will write on the history of the previous dynasty. So what this bibliographical chapter tells us, and I will just read this very rapidly, is that it explains the title like this: the Liu, these are the words of Master Kong, Confucius, therefore, as he replied to his disciples and contemporaries, and the words expressed by the disciples when they spoke amongst themselves, and what they heard said directly by the Master. At the time, the disciples each had their way of taking notes. After the Master's death, traditionally dated back to 479 before our era, his adepts, in other words, those who would come to his door literally, collected these notes to make a collection of his words. It was this process of taking notes based on the words said by the Master that the text of the Liu was formed. What is interesting, and we saw this last year, is that in the same bibliographical chapter, there is talk about another version of the text, which was supposedly found, written. In this case, it's not, first of all, an oral transmission, but a version written in ancient characters. Now, under the Han Dynasty, when they speak about Ku Zu or Ku Wen, meaning writings or ancient graphic, certainly they're talking about graphics that were prior to the standardization of graphics used in official documents that started under the reign of the first emperor. So it's well known, unifying space in 221 BC. What is quite meaningful and interesting to understand the process of unification and centralization of space in China to form a new imperial order starting in the 3rd and 2nd century BC, is that one of the first gestures by the first emperor consisted precisely in unifying the written forms in official documents for obvious reasons, to transmit orders from the imperial court and to have them disseminated throughout China. So this other passage, which evokes a written version, says the following: towards the end of the reign of Emperor Ho, who reigned from 140 to 87 BC, the king Gomdlo, Lo being Confucius' birthland, wanted to demolish the former home of Master Kong to enlarge his own palace. This is how he discovered several works, a book and documents using ancient writings and the Treaty of Rights, a collection of words, the Luyu, precisely, a book of piety between son and father, about 10 chapters, pian, all written in ancient characters. At the time when King Gong was about to enter Confucius's former home, he heard music with drums coming from the walls. He was afraid and he stopped the demolition. Now, these two stories concern two channels of transmission of the text of the Luyu. One, primarily oral, which went through the disciples, who wrote down, and here I'm quoting the Hangshu, what they heard directly said by the master, and the other with a written form, in the form of the text that was claimed to be found in the former home of Confucius, in his homeland in Lo. The common denominator between all of these stories is that they all stress continuity of the transmission process, be it continuity of direct oral transmission from master to disciple, or continuity represented via written texts that were discovered in the very home of Confucius. And therefore, these are the passages we studied last year, passages from the Han Shu. Let me remind you that this story was compiled in the 1st century BC, in other words, 5 or 6 centuries after Confucius's lifetime. These are the excerpts that have led to the general idea that Chinese tradition, followed by Western sinology, faithfully, has formed over 2,000 years regarding the composition of the Luyu. In other words, the idea of a compilation by the disciples or subsequent disciples of Confucius. Now, this perception of the formation of the Luyu as a continuous process of transmission of the very words of the master, as I said earlier, ipsissima verba. This continued since the Han Dynasty for 2 millennia. The theoretical model for forming ancient texts, and the Luyu in particular, that prevailed since several centuries ago until today, may therefore be described briefly as cumulative or evolutive, accretive or evolutive. In other words, a model of construction that is not always naively linear, but I insist, remains continuous. Although it has been presented in every possible form one could imagine, but this cumulative model remains essentially the textual sedimentation or the textual stratification. In other words, we have a sort of accumulation, layer by layer, of texts over the centuries. And therefore, the text of the Luyu, as we have received it and as we know it today, meaning the textus receptus, is formed of a superimposition of stratus, layers accumulated over the years. This model was proposed in China at least since a millennium, but it was clearly developed and explicited as of the 17th and 18th century by Japanese critical commentators extremely well known. The names, I gave you the names last year. For example, Ito Jinsai and Ogyu Sorai in the 17th and 18th century, great Japanese scholars who started to draw a distinction between different layers in the text of the Luyu. This stratification endeavor then continued under the Manchu Dynasty in the 18th century by the philologist Chu. And it is this model of stratification that was continued as is by the Western or the British sinologist Arthur Waley. I have already pointed out his translation of the Luyu in English dating back in 1938, entitled The Analects of Confucius. So the Luyu is known in the French language as the entretien or interview, whereas in the Anglo-American world they speak of the Analects. We then saw this theory of stratification, which was gradually refined. Some American sinologists spoke of 4 layers. And this theory of stratification reached its summit, if I dare say, with the works carried out by a couple of American sinologists, Bruce and Tycho Brooks. And they claimed that they reconstituted the original Analects in a work that was published in the United States in 1998. Now, especially in the North American context, in the United States, when an ad speaks about the original, be it for whiskey or for chips, when you hear about the original, that really means the real McCoy, genuine, primitive, primeval, and so on. So this idea that was presented by this couple is that the text, the Luyu, was formed by accretion, as they call it. We had a long discussion last year as to how to translate accretion into French, until someone pointed out that in French you can speak about accrétion. In other words, just try to imagine this is a process of accumulation, a bit like a coral reef or the circles in a tree trunk, in a cumulative, linear, and regular process. Naturally, this accretion theory presupposes a sort of continuity between the living words of the master and what you can read in the text of the Luyu. So this assumption, and this was pointed out several times, is the basic assumption of the entire Chinese tradition. As a matter of fact, even the most critical historians of modern times, and I'm thinking, for example, of the historian from the University of Beijing, whom I've spoken of before here, Li Ling. He still considers that once, one by one, you remove the layers of sedimentation, a bit like an onion, we can find the original Confucius. Now, these assumptions regarding continuity started to be called into question, first of all, and I am stressing this point because the Chinese, of course, it's always a problem to speak about the Chinese in general. But anyway, let us say that a good number of Chinese today, especially in a context with rising nationalism, many Chinese today tend to forget the fact that the Japanese scholars and commentators were amongst the first to bring about changes in sinological studies. Here you have the name of Kaneto Mamoru, who worked in the 60s and 70s in particular, and he started to call into question this assumption of continuity. It just so happens that my master at the Fudan University in Shanghai, who has died recently, I'm referring to Zhu Weijing. Apparently, I said, without really knowing about the work carried out by Kaneto Mamoru, on his side, he was amongst the first contemporary historians in the 20th century in China to radically call into question the traditional dates given for the Luyu, at the same time as relations between this text and the figure of Confucius. In a key article written in 1987 entitled Li Shi de Gongzi, Yu Gongzi de Li Shi, meaning the Confucius of history and the history of Confucius, Zhu Weijing notes that there is no Chinese equivalent before the modern era, except maybe for He Shu in the 18th century, whom I referred to earlier, but that there was no Chinese equivalent of research conducted in the 19th century by European philologists specializing in the Bible, be it the Old or New Testament. This philosophical research seeking to establish the dates and the presumed authors of each book or chapter in the biblical corpus. In all likelihood, Zhu Weijing is alluding here to the work carried out by the representatives of the Religionsgeschichte, meaning the history of religions, and Protestant theologians in the 19th century in Germany. Amongst the best known, we have Albert Eichhorn or Hermann Gunkel, and you have the other names here. Rudolf Bultmann, of course, is closer to us. He worked mainly on the New Testament. So these critical commentators applied to the biblical text methods of reading and a critical analysis and interpretation, such as the Formgeschichte. Formgeschichte meaning the history of form. This refers to a critical reading of the biblical corpus, drawing a distinction between different forms or literary structures, or you may call it different genres, The word genre is used here to translate the German word Gattung. These works sought to try to go back to the historical, cultural context and origin, or even the sociological origin of these texts. And this context is now known in Germany by a well-known expression, sitz im Leben. In other words, sitting in life. To give you a very simple example, a text of prayer may be read and understood in its original sense, but it must be placed in its sitz im Leben. In other words, sitting in life, in its original context, which is cultural and religious in this case. This school of German biblical criticism, it just so happened that it was very present today in the work carried out by a new generation of sinologists, many of whom just so happen to be German or of German origin. And they conduct research and teach at universities around the world, because our German colleagues are less fortunate than we are, and they must go and sell, so to speak, their skills outside of Germany, where they can't find a job as a sinologist. So these German sinologists are spread around the world, especially in the United States. And a large of them are part of the deconstructionist movement inspired by the German school of biblical criticism. What is quite interesting is that when you speak with them, they are not always absolutely aware of the fact that they apply this type of method, because these are methods that they have absorbed as babies in their intellectual training in Germany. But it is a striking phenomenon today. These new critical philologists stress for the pre-imperial period, and even well beyond that, when I speak of pre-imperial period, conventionally, that is the ancient times prior to the unification of the Chinese space in year 221. They all note in this pre-imperial period and beyond that the lack of stability in the text, not only for reasons that you'd normally imagine, in other words, due to losses, omissions, errors by the copyists, but more fundamentally due to the very structure of the text. In other words, the fact that it was a lot of ancient texts were at random, fragmentary, and that was explained by losses and omissions and the like. But in actual fact, for them, the explanation is to be found elsewhere, and in actual fact should be sought out in the very structure of the text, in the way the text is composed, or even in view of the material composition, a material situation in which they were put down in writing. This awareness was due to two factors that are now working today concomitantly. First of all, you have the criticism of the text, largely inspired from the method applied to the biblical corpus. This critical rereading of the textual sources transmitted is today stimulated by a second factor, meaning the manuscripts found in tomes thanks to archaeological excavations practiced since several decades. When I say several decades, in fact, that dates back to the 1970s, and that's quite a paradox to see that during the Cultural Revolution, with the Red Guards, who would obstinately seek to demolish any remains of traditional culture and all its monuments. At the same time, you had archaeologists who were excavating the soil in China to take out remains of traditional culture. So we have these two factors: a radical shift in methodology, in the reading techniques, and the archaeological factor. These two factors force us to radically change our way of perceiving the text. European and a modern tradition has accustomed us to conceiving it as a continuous essay or work due to a single author. When you hear of a text or book, we tend to think of that text along those lines. In other words, a fragment of a text that is self-sufficient, self-contained, and that can be attributed to a specific author or to a school at least. Naturally, that does not mean that this type of text, the way we conceive of it today in modern times, cannot exist in ancient China. But it has become quite likely today that that was not the norm. We've seen that the traditional Chinese terminology applied to ancient textual sources would take as a unit not the work or the book, the way we conceive of it today, but rather the pian. In other words, the strips of bamboo. And due to its material nature, these strips each had a column of characters, and therefore they were relatively mobile. There's nothing to prevent you from combining the strips in the order you wish. So these pian are now considered as textual units, referred to by different terms or expressions, usually in English, because now we can say that there is a sort of imperialism of the English language in sinology, like in the rest, as a matter of fact. And therefore, the terminology is primarily in English today. You have those who speak about movable units, or others who speak about building blocks. Building blocks, a bit like cubes in a construction game. And you have others, such as Edward Shaughnessy, another American sinologist, who, by the way, should be coming here to the Collège de France to give a series of lectures in next June 2013. So Edward Shaughnessy speak of pericopes. Pericopes, you speak of a pericope, not to be confused with a periscopy or periscope. So, of course, this is an ancient Greek word which means the act of cutting around. Today, this is a technical term that is used more specifically in the exegesis, biblical or Christian exegesis of sacred texts or in liturgy. And therefore, the word clearly designates the fact that what you're cutting up is a piece of text forming a whole, forming a unit in itself, and that is relatively self-sufficient. I can see that I'm running out of time, but just to give an example of a pericope that you will recognize straight away, this is a pericope that was largely studied by critical commentators of all sorts. The pericope of the woman adulteress in John 8:1 to 11. I will read this pericope, not because I want to interfere with biblical and Christian commentators. I think there are more than enough of them. But because, as you shall see later on, it is quite important for our study on Confucius. You'll find it a bit hard at the beginning to see the relationship, but let me read it to you. So Jesus went up the Olive Mount. He went to the temple, and everyone came to him, and he sat down and started to teach. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him, that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped, and I like this indication a lot, this didascalia in a way. But Jesus stooped down and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself, and he said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last, and Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself, and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go, and sin no more. Now, this is a well-known story, even for those of you who are not familiar with the entire story. This led to the famous expression to cast the first stone. Now this pericope, and here I'm showing you a few illustrations. Here you have an illustration in a manuscript, I believe it in the 5th or 6th century, and of course you have iconographic representations. Of course, it's a theme that has largely inspired painters. This is a view of a painting by Titian, and here a painting by Nicolas Poussin. And here, the surprise for the end is a Chinese-style version that you find, well, anyway, apparently, it's in the form of illustrated catechism, quite recent. And therefore, this pericope, which is very well known, does not appear in the most ancient manuscripts, from what has been said. Some later manuscripts place it elsewhere, in John, or even at the end, and some even challenge that it was written by in the Gospel of John. Anyway, the story itself is a very ancient story and has circulated for some time before it was integrated in the Gospel. So we could ask ourselves questions regarding the authenticity, the original aspect of the story, if it were to be connected with the real historical Jesus. And that doubt has largely been maintained by moralizing commentators, for whom to pardon a woman in adultery was really scandalous. But as I said before, we're not interested here in interfering with the many interpretations of this pericope, but to note as of now that there will be some analogies with the construction of texts in ancient China, and more specifically the one we are focusing on, namely the Luoyu in its relations with Confucius. In other words, we'll probably have similar questions to ask ourselves regarding some pericopes that appear in the Luoyu and that have always been associated with Confucius, being convinced that Confucius really said this or did that. But in actual fact, there are some questions that may be raised regarding the authenticity of these pericopes. Well, thank you for your attention that you have been preserving, and I dare say nothing about next week. If ever I were not able to attend, of course, I will do my utmost to inform you as quickly as possible, at least via the internet. In which case, I hope that we will see each other at the start of January next year. Thank you once again.